The day Lucas Bennett inherited his family's $100 million wine empire, he unearthed a human skull among the precious vines, its jaw frozen in a silent scream that would shatter 5 generations of lies. As he stared at the gruesome discovery, his grandmother's quiet voice behind him whispered, "So, you found what your great-grandfather tried so hard to keep buried." The morning sun cast long shadows across Bennett Estate's rolling vineyards, painting the neatly arranged rows of vines in stripes of gold and shadow. Lucas Bennett stood at the edge of the eastern plot, his archaeologist's eye automatically noting the subtle variations in soil color where the construction crew had marked the boundaries for the new wine cave. The late October air carried the rich scent of harvest, ripened grapes, freshly turned earth, and the promise of another award-winning vintage. "Mr. Bennett?" Maria Rodriguez's voice drew his attention from the landscape. The anthropologist stood a few yards away, her usual professional composure slightly shaken. "We found something during the preliminary survey. You need to see this." Lucas followed her past the construction markers to a freshly excavated test pit. The California morning suddenly felt colder as he peered into the hole. Partially exposed in the dark soil was an unmistakable shape, the curved edge of a human skull. "There's more," Maria said quietly, directing his gaze to a rusted length of chain nearby. "We found restraints. Multiple sets." The world seemed to tilt beneath Lucas's feet. He'd spent his entire academic career studying the archaeology of winemaking traditions, but nothing had prepared him for this discovery on his own family's land. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably his twin sister Emma, already on her way back from San Francisco after his urgent text about the construction delay. "Stop all excavation work immediately," he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "Document everything exactly as we found it, and get me Dr. Washington from Barclay on the phone. We'll need his expertise in 19th century California labor practices." As Maria nodded and stepped away, Lucas's gaze drifted to the Victorian mansion crowning the hilltop. The morning sun painted its weathered brick walls a deceptively warm rose gold, but now the shadows in its corners seemed deeper, darker. 5 generations of Bennetts had lived and died in that house, building one of Napa Valley's most respected wineries. His grandmother Margaret still occupied the East Wing, her pride in their family legacy evident in every carefully preserved artifact and photograph. The sound of tires on gravel announced Emma's arrival. She emerged from her Tesla in a tailored suit that seemed incongruous among the vines, her usual courthouse confidence replaced by concern. "Lucas, what's going on?" Your message was cryptic. He led her to the pit wordlessly, watching as understanding dawned in her eyes. Emma had always been the family's moral compass, choosing civil rights law over the more lucrative corporate path their parents had envisioned. Now, looking at the evidence before them, Lucas knew their lives were about to change irrevocably. "We need to tell Gran," Emma said finally, her voice tight with emotion. "Do we?" Lucas countered, already thinking of the implications. "This could destroy everything our family has built. The brand, the heritage labels, our reputation in the industry. That reputation was built on bones, apparently." Emma's tone was sharp. "We can't just cover this up." Before Lucas could respond, a familiar voice called from the direction of the house. Their grandmother Margaret approached slowly, leaning on her carved vineyard walking stick. Even at 82, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had spent decades as the face of Bennett Estate Wines. "I saw the construction had stopped," she said, her keen eyes taking in their serious expressions. "What have you found?" Lucas watched his grandmother's face carefully as they showed her the excavation. To his surprise, she showed no shock, only a deep, ancient sadness. "So it's finally come to light," she said softly. "I had hoped," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Come to my study, both of you. There's something you need to see." As they followed their grandmother up the winding path to the house, Lucas caught Emma's eye. They'd spent their childhood exploring every corner of the estate, but suddenly it felt like foreign territory. The weight of history, their family's history, pressed down on him like the fog that sometimes rolled in from the bay, obscuring the familiar landscape. Inside Margaret's study, the morning light filtered through leaded glass windows, illuminating walls lined with leather-bound books and vintage wine labels. Their grandmother moved slowly to an antique desk, withdrawing a key from around her neck to unlock the bottom drawer. From it, she produced a small leather journal, its pages yellow with age. "Your great-grandfather Giovanni's diary," she explained, handling it with careful reverence. "I found it when your grandfather passed, but I couldn't bear to destroy it, even though perhaps I should have." Lucas accepted the journal with trembling hands. As an archaeologist, he'd handled countless historical documents, but none had ever felt this heavy with significance. Emma leaned in close as he opened to the first page, where elegant Italian script dated 1880 spelled out the beginning of their family's darkest secret. The leather binding crackled as Lucas turned the brittle pages, his trained eye automatically scanning the Italian script for key phrases. Beside him, Emma's breath caught as dates and numbers began to emerge from the faded ink inventory lists that went far beyond grape harvests and wine barrels. Today acquired 4 more workers from Miller's operation. Lucas translated, his voice growing hollow. Cost, $75 per head. They will serve well in the lower vineyard expansion. Christ. He looked up at his grandmother, who had sunk into her leather armchair, suddenly looking every one of her 82 years. "Keep reading," Margaret said softly. "The truth doesn't improve, but you need to understand." Emma paced the study, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors their great-grandfather had installed. "I don't understand, Gran. We learned about California's history, about the Chinese Exclusion Act, about labor exploitation, but this is different. Giovanni Bennett wasn't always Giovanni Bennett," Margaret explained, her fingers tracing patterns on her armchair's worn leather. "He was Giovanni Benetti when he arrived from Tuscany. He changed it, became more American, but he brought old-world cruelties with him and found new ones here." Lucas continued reading, his academic detachment crumbling with each entry. The diary detailed a systematic operation. Vulnerable workers, mostly Chinese laborers fleeing persecution, Native Americans displaced from their lands, and other marginalized groups purchased, worked to exhaustion, and when they died. "The lower vineyard," he whispered. "That's where we found, where the bodies are," Margaret finished. "Yes, your father never knew. Your grandfather suspected but chose not to look too closely. I discovered the truth too late to change the past, but perhaps not too late for you to change the future." A sharp knock at the study door made them all jump. Maria Rodriguez stood in the doorway, a tablet in hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Dr. Washington has arrived from Berkeley. He's examining the site now." Single quotes through the study's bay window. Lucas could see James Washington's tall figure moving carefully around the excavation area, his gray hair bright in the morning sun. The historian's expertise in California's hidden history of slavery and forced labor had made him both celebrated and controversial in academic circles. "Dr. Washington says," Maria hesitated, glancing at Margaret. "He says this could be one of the largest discovered sites of its kind in Northern California." Emma stopped pacing. "How many?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Based on initial ground-penetrating radar surveys, at least 30 distinct burials. Possibly more." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas found himself staring at the walls of vintages, each bottle now seeming to hold not just wine, but blood. Their family's most celebrated vintages, the 1890 Cabernet that won their first international award, the 1910 Zinfandel that established their reputation, were harvested by enslaved hands. The Italian newspapers called Giovanni a visionary when he died, Margaret said, reaching for a framed article on her desk. They praised his American success story. No one asked about the cost. She paused, weighing her next words carefully. There's more. The diary isn't the only record. She stood slowly, moving to a painting that had hung in the study for as long as Lucas could remember. A landscape of the estate from 1885. With surprising strength, she lifted it from the wall, revealing a wall safe behind it. The combination, she said, is your father's birthday. I never told him about this safe. I couldn't bear to shatter his pride in his heritage. But you two, you're stronger than we were. Better, I hope. Lucas stepped forward, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the dial. Inside the safe, neat stacks of ledgers and documents filled the space. On top lay a stack of photographs, their edges curling with age. The first photo showed a group of workers in the vineyard, chains visible at their ankles. The second showed a man who must be Giovanni, standing proudly beside a freshly dug cellar, the same wine cave they were now attempting to expand. In the background, barely visible, were figures working in conditions that made Lucas's stomach turn. All these years, Emma breathed, we've been living on top of a mass grave and profiting from it, Lucas added, thinking of the multi-million-dollar wine empire they'd inherited. Every bottle they'd sold, every award they'd won, every accolade their family had received, all of it stained by the suffering documented in these photographs and ledgers. Doctor, Washington's voice drifted up from the excavation site, carried on the morning breeze. We'll need to establish a proper archaeological protocol. This is a sensitive historical site now. Emma squared her shoulders, her lawyer's mind already racing ahead. We'll need to go public. Set up an investigation commission. Contact the descendants if we can find them. It'll destroy us, Lucas interrupted. Everything we've built, everything they built, Emma corrected sharply, gesturing at the photographs. On their backs, with their lives, Margaret watched her grandchildren with a mixture of sorrow and pride. Your father used to say that wine is truth in a bottle, that you can taste the soil, the sun, the history in every sip. Well, now you know the full history. The question is, what will you do with that truth? Lucas stood at the edge of the excavation site as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the vineyard. Doctor, Washington's team had established a preliminary grid system, methodically documenting each grim discovery. The rhythmic click of camera shutters punctuated the otherwise heavy silence. The restraints show signs of prolonged use, Doctor, Washington explained, his academic tone barely masking his own discomfort. The wear patterns on the shackles, combined with the skeletal evidence we're finding, suggest systematic abuse over many years. Emma had been on her phone for the past hour, pacing between the rows of vines while consulting with colleagues from her civil rights law firm. Her voice carried across the vineyard in fragments. Historical investigation, potential criminal implications, reparative justice framework. The sound of tires on gravel announced another arrival. Richard Chun, the Bennett Estates marketing director, emerged from his car looking confused. Lucas, I got your message about an archaeological discovery, but why cancel tomorrow's distributor meeting? We're about to launch the Heritage Collection. Lucas felt bile rise in his throat. The Heritage Collection, their new premium line celebrating the traditional methods of their ancestors. The labels featured sepia-toned photos of early harvest scenes, carefully curated to show only the romantic aspects of 19th century winemaking. The Heritage Collection is canceled, Emma said firmly, ending her phone call and joining them. In fact, we need to halt all marketing and sales operations immediately. Richard's face paled. What? We have contracts, commitments. The holiday season is our biggest revenue period. Show him, Lucas said quietly to Maria. who had been cataloging the photographic evidence. As Richard looked through the photos and documents, his marketing-polished veneer cracked. "Oh God," he whispered. "The Asian American Vintners Association just gave us their Legacy Award last month." The irony wasn't lost on Lucas. Their family's carefully constructed narrative of immigrant success was unraveling thread by bloody thread. He thought of the interviews he'd given, proudly describing his great-great-grandfather's innovative labor practices and agricultural vision. A commotion near the mansion drew their attention. Several news vans were pulling up to the main gate. Apparently, word had already leaked. Emma's jaw tightened. It was bound to happen. A construction crew of 20 people, all with smartphones. "Mr. Bennett." A reporter was already shouting from the gate. "Is it true you've discovered human remains on your property? Are they connected to historical labor practices?" Before Lucas could respond, Emma stepped forward. "We will be holding a formal press conference tomorrow morning. Until then, we ask for privacy as we work with historical experts to properly document this significant discovery." Her diplomatic response didn't deter the growing media presence. More vehicles were arriving, and Lucas could see camera lenses pointed toward the excavation site. Decades of carefully managed public relations were about to implode. "We need to talk to the employees," Lucas realized suddenly. All of them, before they hear it from the news. Bennett Estate employed over 100 people, many of them from families that had worked the vineyard for generations. The seasonal workers, the cellar staff, the tasting room employees, all of their livelihoods were now in question. As if reading his thoughts, Maria spoke up. "Many of the workers are already talking. Jose in the cellar, his great-grandfather worked here in the 1890s. He's been asking questions about the old records." Lucas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. How many of their current employees were unknowingly connected to this dark history? How many families had stories they'd been afraid to tell? The sound of breaking glass shattered the tension. Everyone turned to see Margaret standing in the doorway of the mansion, the remains of a wine bottle scattered at her feet. It was a bottle of their most prestigious wine, the Giovanni's Reserve Cabernet, named for the very man whose crimes they were uncovering. "I served this to presidents," Margaret said, her voice shaking, "to dignitaries, to wine critics who praised its history in every bottle. If they only knew what that history really was." Emma rushed to steady her grandmother, but Margaret waved her away. "No, I don't deserve comfort. I knew enough to suspect, but I chose ignorance. Just like your grandfather did. Just like your father would have, Mrs. Bennett." Maria called from the excavation site. "We found something else. Something you should see." In a newly opened section of the dig, partially exposed by the afternoon's careful work, lay a small gold locket. "Doctor." Washington carefully brushed away decades of soil, revealing delicate engravings. "Chinese characters," he noted, examining it through his glasses. "A name, I think, and a date. 1883. Lucas watched as Emma's legal training visibly kicked in. "We can trace this, find descendants. There must be records, immigration documents, there are." Margaret's voice was barely audible. "In the safe, Giovanni kept everything. Names, purchases, family connections. He was proud of his record keeping." The sun was setting now, casting a blood-red glow across the vineyard. The distant sounds of press cameras and murmuring onlookers created a surreal backdrop to their grim discoveries. Tomorrow, the story would break. Tomorrow, the carefully maintained image of Bennett Estate would crumble. But tonight, standing in the growing darkness, Lucas made a decision. "We don't just expose this," he said, looking at his sister. "We make it right. Whatever that takes." The next morning dawned gray and cold, a heavy fog shrouding the vineyard in an appropriate gloom. Lucas stood in his father's old office, his office now, staring at the wall of awards and accolades that suddenly seemed like accusations. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Distributors, restaurant partners, wine club members, all demanding answers. Emma had transformed the mansion's formal dining room into an impromptu command center. Her laptop opened to a document titled Bennett Estate Reconciliation Initiative, Draft 1. She'd been up all night, consulting with colleagues and experts in historical justice and corporate responsibility. "The press conference is in an hour," she said without looking up. "I've prepared a statement, but you should be the one to deliver it. You're the face of the company, the wine expert, the one they trust." Lucas laughed bitterly. "Trust? After this?" "Yes, after this." Emma finally met his eyes. "Especially after this. Because we're choosing to expose the truth ourselves, to take responsibility, to make amends. That has to count for something." A soft knock interrupted them. Maria Rodriguez entered, followed by Dr. Washington and a new face, a distinguished-looking Chinese-American woman in her 60s. "This is Dr. Helen Chun from the California Historical Society," Maria introduced. She's been researching 19th century labor trafficking in the wine industry. Dr. Chun's expression was carefully neutral as she surveyed the room. "I've studied the Bennett Estate records before, what was publicly available, at least. There were always gaps in the narrative. We're filling those gaps now," Emma said, standing to shake her hand. "We need your help to do it right, Doctor." Chun placed a thick folder on the table. "These are records of Chinese immigrant families who disappeared in this region between 1880 and 1890. Many were simply listed as moved on or whereabouts unknown. But I always suspected." Lucas felt the weight of those disappeared lives pressing down on him. Each missing person report represented a family torn apart, a story violently ended, a truth buried beneath his family's precious vines. Richard Chun, no relation to Dr. Chun, burst into the room, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. The sommelier from French Laundry just called. "They're removing all Bennett wines from their list. Others are following suit." "Let them," Lucas said quietly. "We're suspending all sales anyway." "The entire operation?" Richard's voice cracked. "Lucas, that's millions in revenue. The harvested grapes alone will rot on the vines if necessary," Emma finished firmly. "We're not selling another bottle until we understand the full scope of this and develop a comprehensive reconciliation plan." Through the window, Lucas could see the media presence had grown. News vans lined the estate's entrance, and a helicopter circled overhead. The story was about to explode. Margaret appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on her cane. She'd aged years overnight, but her spine was straight as she addressed the room. "I've been making calls. Other old wine families. They're nervous. What happened here? It wasn't unique to Bennett Estate, Doctor." Washington nodded grimly. "We've suspected as much. The rapid expansion of California's wine industry in the 1880s required massive labor forces. The Chinese Exclusion Act created a perfect storm for exploitation. We can't fix the whole industry's past," Emma said, "but we can set a precedent for how to address it." Lucas picked up the statement Emma had prepared. The words swam before his eyes. Systematic exploitation, historical accountability, commitment to truth and reconciliation. How could mere words begin to address generations of buried crimes? A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the fog, Lucas could see a group of their seasonal workers gathering near the excavation site. Jose from the cellar was among them, holding what appeared to be old photographs. "They want to help," Maria explained. "Many of them have family stories, passed down through generations. Stories about missing relatives, about workers who never came home." Dr. Chun moved to the window, studying the gathering crowd. "This is what reconciliation looks like. Not just acknowledgement from the top, but participation from everyone affected. These workers' oral histories could be crucial to understanding the full scope of what happened here." The clock on the mantle struck 9. In 1 hour, Lucas would have to face the cameras and change the narrative of Bennett Estate forever. Not just a public story, but the story they told themselves for generations. "Before we go out there," he said, turning to face the room, "I need everyone to understand something. This isn't just about saving the company or our reputation. From this moment on, Bennett Estate exists for one purpose: to uncover the truth and make what amends we can. Everything else is secondary." Emma squeezed his hand. Together, Lucas nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Not just for his family's legacy now, but for all the families their success had buried. The press conference was a blur of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Lucas stood at the podium they'd set up on the mansion's front steps, his voice steady as he read Emma's carefully crafted statement. But it was the unscripted moment that would make headlines when he stopped mid-sentence, looked directly into the cameras, and said, "Every bottle of Bennett wine ever sold was produced on land that holds the bodies of the enslaved. We cannot change that truth. But from this day forward, we refuse to profit from it." Now, 3 days later, the reality of that declaration was sinking in. The entire estate had been designated a historical crime scene. Yellow police tape marked off the excavation areas, which had expanded as ground-penetrating radar revealed more burial sites scattered throughout the vineyard. Lucas sat in the wine library, surrounded by their most precious vintages. Bottles worth thousands of dollars each, now tainted by knowledge. Dr. Washington entered, carrying a stack of newly translated documents. "The ledgers are revealing a pattern," he said, spreading papers across the antique tasting table. Giovanni didn't work alone. There was a network of wealthy landowners, corrupt officials, labor traffickers, names. Emma demanded, looking up from her laptop. She'd been working around the clock, building legal frameworks for what they were calling the Vineyard Justice Project. "Some you'll recognize, Doctor," Washington replied carefully. "Families that are still prominent in the wine industry." Lucas picked up one of the ledgers, recognizing other vineyard names, estates they'd collaborated with, competed against, shared holiday dinners with. How many of them knew their own histories? A knock at the door interrupted them. Maria entered with Jose from the cellar, who was clutching a worn, leather-bound book. "Mi abuela's diary," Jose said quietly. She wrote about her father. He worked here in 1889. She always said he disappeared, but he placed the diary on the table with trembling hands. Emma immediately began scanning the pages, her legal pad filling with notes. This corroborates the dates in Giovanni's records. "Jose, would your family be willing to make a formal statement?" Before he could answer, Richard burst in, waving his tablet. "The Chinese Cultural Association is calling for a complete boycott. The Workers' Rights Coalition is planning a demonstration. Our stock has dropped 60% since the announcement." "Good," Lucas said, surprising everyone. "Let it all come out. Every connection, every complicit family, every story we buried." "The other vintners are threatening legal action," Richard continued. "They're saying your public statements are damaging the entire industry's reputation. They should be more worried about their own ledgers." "Doctor," Washington muttered, turning another page of Giovanni's records. Margaret appeared in the doorway, moving slower than ever, but with fierce determination in her eyes. "The wine cellar," she said. "We need to check behind the north wall." Lucas felt a chill. "Gran? There were always rumors about hidden rooms, smuggling tunnels. Your grandfather forbade anyone from renovating that section. Single quotes. She gripped her cane tighter. I think we'll find more than wine behind those walls." "Doctor." Chen arrived as they were discussing how to proceed. She carried printouts of immigration records from the 1880s. "The locket we found? I've identified the family. They have living descendants in San Francisco." Emma immediately began making notes. We'll need to establish a formal contact protocol. Ensure proper cultural sensitivity. They're already here, Doctor. Chum interrupted softly, outside the gate. Along with other families who've seen the news and recognized their own missing pieces of history, Lucas moved to the window. Through the morning fog, he could see a growing gathering of people at the estate's entrance. Some held photographs, others carried family documents. All of them were waiting for answers. "We need to let them in," he said. "All of them." "Lucas," Richard protested. "The liability issues alone." "No more hiding," Lucas cut him off. "No more protecting reputations. This estate belongs to their stories, now more than it ever belonged to us." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of construction equipment starting up echoed from the excavation site. "Doctor." Washington's team was beginning their examination of a new area where ground-penetrating radar had revealed anomalies. Emma closed her laptop decisively. "I'm going to talk to the families. Their stories need to be our priority now. The legal implications, the financial fallout, all of that comes second." "The wine," Margaret said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood before the library's collection, her hand resting on a bottle of their most famous vintage. "What do we do with all of this?" Lucas considered the thousands of bottles aging in their cellars, each one now a testimony to hidden crimes. An idea began to form, radical but fitting. "We auction it," he said slowly. "Every bottle, every vintage, and every dollar goes to a foundation for the descendants of those who died here. We'll never sell another bottle of Bennett wine, but these last ones, they can help fund the search for truth." The room fell silent as the weight of his proposal sank in. Generations of winemaking tradition, millions in inventory, their entire family identity, all of it transformed from a source of pride into a tool for redemption. The days that followed brought a parade of revelations, each more devastating than the last. The hidden room behind the wine cellar's north wall contained exactly what Margaret had feared: a makeshift prison, complete with chains bolted to the stone walls and desperate messages, scratched into the rock in Chinese characters and Native American symbols. "Doctor." Chum worked tirelessly to translate the messages, each one adding a human voice to the ledger's cold numbers. "This one reads, 'Remember Wong Lei, who died without seeing his son,'" she reported, her professional composure cracking slightly. "And here, the mountain spirits know what they do to us." The estate had become a hub of activity, but not the kind they were used to. Instead of wine tourists and luxury cars, the parking lot was filled with forensic vehicles, documentary film crews, and a steady stream of families coming to search for connections to their lost ancestors. Emma had transformed the tasting room into a reception area for visiting families. Where tourists once sampled $100 wines, people now shared photographs and documents, piecing together generations of deliberately obscured history. "We've confirmed 28 families so far," she told Lucas one evening, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Each one has a story that intersects with our family's wealth. The Chen family lost 4 brothers here. The Garcias lost a grandfather and 2 uncles. The Thompson family, their Native American ancestors were brought here in chains from a reservation raid." Lucas nodded, barely able to meet her gaze. He'd spent the day with Dr. Washington, examining a newly discovered cache of letters in the mansion's attic. Giovanni had kept correspondence with other vineyard owners, discussing their labor acquisition methods with disturbing casualness. "The auction catalog is ready," Richard said, entering with a thick binder. "Final inventory: 24,865 bottles, including the entire library collection. Estimated value: just over $12 million. Add the Giovanni's reserve cases," Lucas decided. "The ones we were saving for the centennial." Richard blanched. "Lucas, that's another $3 million in wine. All of it goes," Lucas insisted. "Every drop we profited from." Maria appeared in the doorway. "You need to see this," she said urgently. "We found something in the old foreman's quarters." The small building near the workers' dormitories had yielded another grim discovery: a ledger of punishments, methodically recording the torture and death of workers who attempted to escape. The entries were written in multiple hands, proof that the system of abuse had continued well after Giovanni's death. "This goes into the 1920s, Doctor," Washington noted grimly. "Well, past your great-grandfather's time." Single quotes. Lucas felt the familiar wave of nausea. How many generations had known? How many had chosen to look away? A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Jose leading a group of current workers toward the mansion. Many carried tools and work gloves. "They're volunteering to help with the excavation," Maria explained. "They want to be part of uncovering the truth." Single quotes. Emma wiped her eyes. "We need to think about the workers' future too. When we shut down operations, we're not shutting down completely." Lucas interrupted, an idea crystallizing. "The land, the facilities, they can be transformed. A research center for agricultural labor history, a memorial, a place of education and remembrance, Doctor." Chan nodded approvingly. Several universities have already expressed interest in establishing research partnerships. This could become a model for how other industries confront their hidden histories. Margaret sat quietly in her favorite chair, watching the activity outside. She held the gold locket they discovered, now cleaned and restored. Tomorrow, it would be returned to the descendants of its owner in a formal ceremony. "I keep thinking about all the wine critics over the years," she said softly. "How they praised our wine's complexity and depth. How they claimed to taste the history in every glass." She gave a bitter laugh. They had no idea how right they were. Lucas moved to the window, watching as more families arrived at the gate. Each day brought new connections, new stories, new pieces of the vast puzzle of pain their family had buried beneath manicured vines and carefully crafted marketing. "The BBC is here for an interview," Richard announced. "They want to talk about the auction and the foundation." "Tell them we'll discuss the future," Emma said firmly. "But first, they need to hear the stories of the families. No more centering the Bennett narrative." Outside, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting long shadows across the excavation sites. Soon, the forensic teams would switch on their floodlights, continuing their careful work into the night. The truth, buried for so long, couldn't wait any longer. A month into the investigation, the full scope of Bennett Estates' dark history was still expanding. The auction of their wine collection had raised over $20 million, well above estimates, as collectors rushed to acquire what would be the last bottles ever produced under the Bennett name. Every penny went into the newly established Vineyard Justice Foundation. But it was the discovery made on a cold Wednesday morning that would shake the California wine industry to its core. "It's a map, Doctor," Washington explained, carefully unrolling the brittle paper they'd found hidden in a false drawer of Giovanni's desk, showing a network of tunnels connecting multiple estates. They used them to move people between properties. Lucas stared at the faded lines connecting familiar names, estates that still dominated Wine Magazine's top ratings, families that judged international competitions, brands that commanded hundreds of dollars per bottle, all implicated in a web of systematic cruelty. "This proves coordination," Emma said, her lawyer's mind racing ahead. "Not isolated incidents, but an organized system of trafficking and forced labor." Before Lucas could respond, Maria burst into the study. "They're here, all of them." Through the window, they could see a line of black luxury cars pulling up to the estate. The owners of the connected vineyards had arrived, drawn by rumors of the map's discovery. Lucas recognized their faces from countless wine industry events, people he'd shared meals with, competed against, respected. "They'll try to suppress this," Emma warned. "Their lawyers are probably already." "Too late," Lucas interrupted, holding up his phone. The BBC documentary team had finished their preliminary edit. It airs tonight. Worldwide, the atmosphere in the room shifted as the implications sank in. Generations of carefully maintained prestige and tradition were about to collapse. Not just for Bennett Estate, but for the entire upper echelon of California wine country. Dr. Chun entered with a stack of newly translated documents. "The tunnel network explains the gaps in our burial records," she said grimly. "They moved workers between properties, making it harder to track disappearances." A sharp knock at the door made everyone jump. Richard stood there, his face ashen. "They're demanding to speak with you, Lucas. All of them." In the main tasting room, single quotes, Lucas straightened his shoulders. "Good. Let's give them a proper tasting of the truth." The tasting room, once a showcase of luxury and refinement, now felt like a tomb. 8 of California's most prestigious vineyard owners sat around the antique tasting table, their faces wearing masks of anger, fear, and calculated neutrality. "You understand what you're about to do." Victor Montague of Montague Cellars spoke first, his voice carefully controlled. "The damage to the industry. The damage was done generations ago." Lucas cut him off. "We're just finally bringing it into the light." "Be reasonable." Catherine St. Clair of St. Clair Vineyards leaned forward. "We can establish a private reconciliation fund. Keep this contained." Emma's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Contained? Like the bodies in the tunnels under your properties?" The room fell silent. Through the window, Lucas could see more families arriving at the gates, drawn by the growing story. Among them, he recognized Jose and other current workers, standing in solidarity with the descendants of those who died on these lands. "The documentary airs in 6 hours," Lucas said quietly. "But you all have a choice. Join us in telling the truth, establishing a real reconciliation process, transforming our industry, or wait for the world to discover what's buried under your vines. You'll destroy everything our families built." Montague growled. "Our families," Lucas responded, emphasizing each word, "built nothing. The people they enslaved, tortured, and murdered built it all. And their descendants deserve more than a private fund and contained reconciliation." The sound of excavation equipment rumbled in the distance. Dr. Washington's team had begun exploring the tunnel entrances. Soon, they would have more than just maps and documents. Margaret appeared in the doorway, supported by Maria. She surveyed the room of wealthy vintners with clear eyes. "I spent decades protecting our family's reputation," she said softly. "That silence made me complicit. It ends now." The BBC documentary, Blood in the Wine, aired globally that night. Lucas watched it in the estate's former wine library, now converted into a research center, surrounded by the families who had become part of their daily life. The room fell silent as decades of carefully hidden history unfolded on screen. The documentary team had done their work well. They wove together the physical evidence from the excavations, the testimonies of descendants, and the damning paper trail into an undeniable narrative of systematic atrocity. But it was the tunnel map that dominated the final segment, the spider web of connections that implicated nearly every major historical vineyard in the region. "The phones are exploding," Richard reported, his tablet buzzing constantly. "Every major news outlet wants comment. The other vineyards are issuing denials. But the evidence is literally underneath their feet," Emma finished. She'd spent the day coordinating with archaeologists, who were already requesting access to the other properties named in Giovanni's documents. The impact was immediate and seismic. By midnight, social media was ablaze with calls for boycotts. Restaurant chains began pulling California wines from their lists. Celebrity wine collectors posted videos of themselves pouring out bottles from implicated vineyards. 4 of the estates have already reached out, Emma said, checking her messages. They want to discuss joining the Reconciliation Initiative. The others are... She paused, reading. The others are destroying evidence as we speak. Lucas felt a cold fury rise in his chest. Get Dr. Washington's team out there. Now, call the Historical Society, the police if necessary. They can't be allowed to bury this again. The next morning brought a new wave of revelations. Workers at other vineyards, inspired by Jose and his colleagues, began coming forward with their own family stories and evidence. One brought a collection of photographs showing tunnel entrances that had been hastily concealed in the 1950s. Another shared letters from his great-grandmother, describing the movement of workers between estates. Dr. Chen arrived mid-morning with more translated documents. The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association has opened their archives, she announced. They kept records of every person who disappeared in this region. Names, dates, last known locations. The list matched perfectly with Giovanni's ledgers. Margaret spent the morning meeting with other vineyard matriarchs, women who, like her, had suspected or known pieces of the truth but chosen silence. Their tears and confessions were recorded for the historical record, adding another layer to the growing testimony. The Vineyard Justice Foundation has received $5 million in anonymous donations since the broadcast, Richard reported. And something else. Photos, recent ones, of other tunnel entrances. Lucas studied the images. These were taken at Montague Cellars. Someone on their staff is talking. Their seasonal workers are walking out, Maria added, demanding that the property be searched. The unions are getting involved. The sound of helicopters drew them to the window. News crews circled overhead, capturing footage of the expanding excavation work. The tunnels were being carefully mapped and explored, each one yielding new evidence of the wine industry's hidden framework of atrocity. Jose appeared in the doorway with a group of workers. "We found something else," he said quietly. In the old storage shed, marriage records. The documents revealed another layer of horror. Forced marriages arranged between enslaved workers, creating generations of trapped families. Children born into bondage, their existence never officially recorded. Emma's hands shook as she read the records. This is why some of the descendants couldn't trace their family histories. Their ancestors' marriages, their very existence, were hidden in these private records. The other vineyards would have similar documents, Dr. Washington noted. If they haven't destroyed them already, Lucas made a decision. Call a press conference. We're going to announce full access to every inch of Bennett Estate for research teams. Set a precedent the others can't ignore. As the sun set that evening, Lucas stood at the highest point of the vineyard, looking down at the floodlit excavation sites. Teams of archaeologists worked carefully in the growing darkness, documenting each new discovery. The families of the disappeared watched from behind protective barriers, bearing witness to the unearthing of their lost history. Margaret joined him, moving slowly with her cane. "I always loved this view," she said softly. The neat rows of vines, the perfect order of it all. I never let myself see what that order was built on. Below them, more newsvans were arriving. The story was still growing, spreading like vine roots through the carefully maintained facade of the California wine industry. The truth, once buried, was finally finding the light. A year passed. The transformation of Bennett Estate from prestigious winery to memorial and research center was complete. The carefully manicured vineyard rows had been partially replaced by memorial gardens, each plant species chosen to represent the diverse cultures of those who had died there. The wine caves now housed a permanent exhibition documenting the industry's dark history. Lucas stood in what had once been the main tasting room, now converted into a conference space, preparing for today's symposium on agricultural labor justice. Scholars, activists, and family representatives from around the world had gathered for the first annual Conference on Historical Agricultural Slavery and Reconciliation. The Montague trial starts next week, Emma said, joining him with a stack of briefing papers. The investigation had revealed active attempts to destroy evidence, leading to criminal charges. Their seasonal workers' testimony was devastating. 3 other major vineyards had followed Bennett Estates' lead, opening their properties to investigators and joining the reconciliation process. The others faced boycotts, lawsuits, and growing public pressure. The California wine industry's reputation had been fundamentally altered. Dr. Chun's team finished translating the last of the wall inscriptions, Maria reported, entering with fresh documentation. Some of them were messages to the future. They believed someday someone would find them and tell their story. The morning's first session would feature Jose and other workers' descendants sharing their family histories. The oral traditions that had preserved truth through generations of institutional silence were finally being recorded and honored. Dr. Washington appeared with a group of graduate students. The estate had become a major research site, with universities establishing fellowship programs focused on investigating agricultural slavery and its modern legacies. The ground-penetrating radar results from St. Clair Vineyards came in, he said grimly. The tunnel network was even more extensive than we thought. And the evidence of systematic violence. Lucas nodded, his jaw tight. Each new discovery reinforced the scale of what their families had done. The weight of generations of deliberate cruelty pressed down heavier with each revelation. Margaret entered slowly, supported by her nurse. Though her health had declined, she insisted on attending every major event at the transformed estate. Today, she would participate in a panel discussion with other industry elders who had chosen to break their silence. The Japanese-American delegation has arrived, Richard announced. His role had shifted from marketing director to community liaison, managing relationships with the growing network of affected communities. They've brought documentation of labor trafficking from the pre-World War II era. Through the window, Lucas could see groups gathering in the memorial garden. The morning fog was lifting, revealing the new reality of Bennett Estate. Where wine tourists once snapped photos with expensive bottles, families now conducted ceremonies of remembrance. Where critics once sampled exclusive vintages, researchers now cataloged evidence of atrocity. The foundation approved another round of educational grants, Emma reported, checking her tablet. Full scholarships for descendants, funding for historical research, support for agricultural labor rights organizations. The auction proceeds and subsequent donations had grown the Vineyard Justice Foundation's endowment to over $50 million. Every cent went to programs supporting education, research, and advocacy. Dr. Chun arrived with an elderly Chinese-American woman, another descendant who had traced her family's tragic connection to the estate. These meetings still happened regularly as more families discovered their lost history through the growing database of records and testimonies. Mrs. Liu has photographs, Dr. Chun explained softly. Her great-uncle disappeared from San Francisco in 1885. His name matches our ledger entries from that year. Lucas watched as the woman slowly placed old photographs on the conference table. Each image was a reminder that the neat numbers in Giovanni's ledgers represented real people, real lives, real losses that echoed through generations. The sound system crackled to life as technicians tested the audio for the day's sessions. Through the speakers came the voice of a worker's descendant, recorded during last month's oral history project. They tried to bury our stories along with our ancestors. But truth grows like a vine. You can cut it back, but its roots run deep. Jose appeared with a group of current workers. Many had chosen to stay on, transforming their roles from vineyard labor to site preservation and education. They had become crucial partners in telling the property's full history. The student groups are arriving, he reported. The estate now hosted regular educational programs for schools. teaching agricultural labor history through the lens of human rights and social justice. Lucas checked his watch. The symposium would begin soon. Hundreds of people would gather to continue the work of excavating truth, preserving memory, and transforming an industry built on buried crimes. 5 years had passed since the first discovery in the vineyard soil. Lucas stood at the podium in the transformed cellar, now an educational center, addressing a new group of researchers and family representatives. The former wine cave's stone walls, once lined with expensive bottles, now held photographs and testimonies, a permanent record of truth replacing the carefully curated fiction that had preceded it. "Welcome to Bennett Memorial and Research Center," he began, the name still catching slightly in his throat. "What you'll learn here is not just the story of one family's crimes or even one industry's dark history. This is a story about the choices we make when confronting inherited guilt, about the possibility of transformation, and about the power of truth to heal across generations." The California wine industry had been fundamentally reshaped. Of the 12 major historical vineyards implicated in the tunnel network, 8 had followed Bennett Estates' lead, converting their properties into memorial and research sites. The others had collapsed under the weight of boycotts, lawsuits, and public condemnation. Emma joined him at the podium to detail the Vineyard Justice Foundation's latest initiatives. The endowment had grown to over $100 million, funding educational programs, research grants, and reparative justice projects across the agricultural sector. "Last month, we awarded our 1,000th scholarship to descendants," she reported, "and our advocacy work has led to new legislation requiring historical labor practice investigations for all agricultural properties over 50 years old." Dr. Washington, now the center's lead historical researcher, presented the latest findings. The network of tunnel discoveries had expanded beyond Napa Valley, revealing similar systems of exploitation throughout California's agricultural regions. What began here has sparked a national conversation about agricultural slavery and its modern legacies, he explained. Similar investigations are now underway in tobacco country, cotton plantations, and other historical farming regions. Margaret had passed away 2 years earlier, but not before recording hours of testimony about the industry's culture of silence. Her final statement had become part of the permanent exhibition. "We thought we were protecting a legacy, but we were really protecting a lie. The true legacy is in the telling of truth, no matter how late it comes." Jose, now the center's director of community relations, led tours for descendants and researchers. The former cellar worker had become one of the most powerful voices in agricultural labor rights, testifying before Congress about the importance of confronting historical crimes. "The workers who died here were not just numbers in a ledger," he would tell visitors. "They were people with dreams, with families, with stories that deserve to be told. We honor them by ensuring their truth shapes the future." Dr. Chen's research had expanded to include similar investigations at historical vineyards across Europe and South America. The Bennett case had become a model for how industries could confront their hidden histories. "Each site we investigate reveals the same pattern," she reported. Systematic exploitation hidden beneath a veneer of tradition and prestige. But now, finally, these stories are being told. The memorial garden had matured, its carefully chosen plants creating a living testimony to the diverse cultures of those who had suffered and died on the property. Families held regular ceremonies there, connecting with their lost ancestors and sharing stories across generations. Richard, who had initially feared the estate's transformation would mean professional suicide, now led workshops for other companies facing similar historical reckonings. "Truth is not just morally right," he would say. "It's the only sustainable business model for the future." The former tasting room, where wealthy visitors once sipped $100 wines, had become a research library. Scholars and students from around the world came to study not just the history of agricultural slavery, but the process of institutional transformation and reconciliation. Lucas looked out at the assembled group, seeing the now familiar mix of academic researchers, family representatives, and industry reformers. The pain of their family's crimes would never fully heal, but the work of truth-telling and transformation continued. 5 years ago, we discovered bodies in our soil, he concluded. But what we really unearthed was the possibility of change. Every bottle of wine we once produced carried an invisible weight of suffering. Now, this land produces something else: truth, memory, and hope for a future built on honest reckoning with the past. After the presentation, Lucas walked alone through the memorial garden. The evening fog was rolling in, softening the landscape where neat rows of vines had once stretched to the horizon. In the distance, he could hear voices, another family gathering to connect with their lost history. The Bennett name no longer stood for prestigious wines or agricultural success. Instead, it had become synonymous with the hard work of confronting historical crimes and choosing truth over tradition. The estate produced no more wine, but it had become fertile ground for something far more valuable: the seeds of transformation, planted in soil finally freed from its buried secrets. The sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the memorial stones that now marked the places where bodies had been found. Each marker bore a name, a date, and a story. The final vintage of Bennett Estate. A harvest of truth that would continue to grow with each passing season. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!